April 11th, 1945. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of spring and the acrid, metallic taste of a dying empire. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood on the muddy west bank of the Elbe River, the cool glass of his binoculars pressed tight against his eyes. He was staring east, across the shimmering water, toward a horizon that held the greatest prize of the 20th century, Berlin. 50 miles. That was all that remained. In the vast geography of the Second World War, where armies had fought across continents and oceans, 50 miles was nothing. It was a morning's drive. It was the final sprint in a marathon that had bled the world dry for 6 years. Simpson's Ninth Army, a juggernaut of 300,000 men, was poised like a coiled spring. They were the most organized, best supplied, and most lethal American fighting force on the European continent. They had just crossed the Elbe at multiple points, their engineers throwing pontoon bridges across the water with practiced efficiency, establishing solid, unbreakable bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The scene before Simpson was surreal. There were no enemy panzers churning up the mud. There were no scream of Stuka dive bombers. Instead, the German Wehrmacht was dissolving in real time. German units were surrendering not by the platoon, but by the division. Ragged, exhausted, and terrified, they were throwing down their Mausers and Lugers, begging to be taken prisoner by the Americans. Their fear was palpable, a desperate panic to be captured by the West before the vengeful storm of the Red Army arrived from the East. The road to Berlin wasn't blocked by tank traps, pillboxes, or the fanatical resistance the Allies had faced in Normandy. It was just asphalt. It was an open highway inviting them in. Simpson could see it clearly. His men could literally drive to the capital without shifting gears. They could feel the end of the war vibrating in the air, a tangible electricity. 2 days. That was the calculation. 2 days of hard driving, perhaps a few skirmishes, and the stars and stripes would be flying over the Reichstag. The heart of the Nazi beast would stop beating. The war in Europe would be over. With a trembling hand, he picked up the field telephone. The connection crackled, linking him to General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group. Simpson's voice was urgent, tight with the adrenaline of the moment, but disciplined. "We can be in Berlin in 24 hours, he reported, the words heavy with historical weight. "The path is clear. Request permission to advance." There was a silence on the line, a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. In that static-filled void, the fate of post-war Europe hung in the balance. Bradley was checking with Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Simpson waited. He watched his soldiers on the far bank, checking their gear, smoking cigarettes, looking east with the same hunger he felt. They were ready. The engines were idling. When Bradley finally came back on the line, his voice was flat, devoid of the triumph Simpson expected. It was the cold, hard voice of bureaucracy overriding tactical brilliance. "The answer is no. Hold your position at the Elbe. No further advance toward Berlin." Simpson froze. The words didn't make sense. "Sir," he stammered, his military bearing momentarily shaken, "we're 50 miles away. The road is open. German resistance is collapsing. We can take the capital and end this war right now." Bradley's response was firm, closing the door on the possibility. "Those are your orders, General. Halt at the Elbe. The Ninth Army will advance no further east." Simpson hung up the phone slowly. He stared across the river at the empty highway stretching toward Berlin. It was a ghost road, calling to them. His army, a force capable of crushing nations, had just been told to stop. Not to slow down for logistics. Not to wait for air support. To stop completely. To sit down and watch the end of the war from the bleachers. Why? The question burned in the minds of every officer and enlisted man on the line. To understand why this order felt like absolute madness, one must understand the sheer velocity of the American advance. Since breaking out from the Rhine River in March 1945, Allied forces had swept across Germany with a speed that defied military logic. It was a blitzkrieg in reverse. Simpson's Ninth Army had devoured over 200 miles in 3 weeks. They had bypassed German strongpoints, ignored threats to their flanks, and driven straight for the jugular. It was mobile warfare at its absolute finest, a symphony of gasoline and steel. To the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army had been equally aggressive, tearing through the German heartland like a wildfire. They had crossed the Rhine without waiting for permission, stolen supplies from other units to keep their tanks moving, and advanced hundreds of miles. Every mile gained was a mile closer to ending the nightmare. By early April, the Ruhr industrial region was surrounded, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops. The Nazi war machine wasn't just losing, it was disintegrating. The path to Berlin was wide open. German field marshals knew it. Hitler, trembling in his bunker, knew it. The common soldiers on both sides knew it. The race was on to see who would get there first, the Americans from the west or the Soviets from the east. Simpson's soldiers could already hear the distant rumble of Soviet artillery, a low, thunderous drumbeat on the horizon. The Red Army was closing in, fighting through fanatical resistance, bleeding for every inch. But on April 11th, the race was effectively won. Simpson's Ninth Army had reached the Elbe first. They had beaten the Soviets to the final natural barrier before the capital. They had the bridgeheads. They had the momentum. All they needed was the word go. Instead, they got the order to halt. When George Patton received the same order, his reaction was volcanic. Patton was 150 miles south of Simpson, driving his Third Army toward Czechoslovakia, but his eyes were fixed on the same prize, Berlin. To Patton, a student of history and a warrior poet, Berlin was the only target that mattered. Taking the German capital would shatter whatever remained of German morale. It would give the United States the symbolic victory that defined who had truly won the war in Europe. More importantly, it would put American forces in a position to dictate the peace. Patton had been arguing for weeks, screaming at anyone who would listen, that the Allies must race for Berlin before the Soviets arrived. He possessed a deep, instinctual distrust of Joseph Stalin. He believed that whoever captured the capital would control the narrative of the post-war world. He was desperate to beat the Russians to the prize, to plant the American flag on the rubble of the Third Reich. Instead, Eisenhower was telling him to stop advancing east and turn south, to ignore the capital of the enemy and focus on capturing territory in southern Germany and Austria. It was baffled rage that filled Patton's command tent. "We're being stopped by politics," Patton spat at his staff officers, his face flushed with anger. Ike is more worried about keeping Stalin happy than winning the war decisively. Patton was right about the politics, but he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He didn't know the full extent of the shadow war being fought in the intelligence briefings at Supreme Headquarters. What Patton couldn't see was the terrified whispers reaching Eisenhower's desk reports about a massive, impregnable German fortress being constructed in the Alps. A national redoubt, this intelligence, flawed and phantom-like, would shape the destiny of Europe. It would determine where American armies marched, and who would ultimately burn Berlin to the ground. And the tragedy was, it was almost completely wrong. The National Redoubt. The name itself sounded formidable. Allied intelligence had painted a picture of a nightmare scenario in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEV, had been tracking these rumors since late 1944. The reports described a massive fortress complex where the Nazi leadership planned to retreat and continue the war indefinitely. The intelligence painted a terrifying, apocalyptic picture. It suggested that elite SS divisions, the most fanatical of Hitler's troops, were withdrawing from the front lines not to surrender, but to occupy prepared positions in the mountains. Reports claimed there were underground factories churning out new miracle weapons, that there were food stockpiles sufficient for years of resistance, that the mountains themselves had been hollowed out into concrete bunkers. According to these dossiers, Hitler and his top commanders would flee Berlin at the last moment to this Alpine fortress. From there, safe behind granite walls and defended by snow-choked passes, they would direct a guerrilla war known as the Werwolf movement. The Wehrmacht would trade conventional warfare for a brutal mountain insurgency. Allied intelligence officers estimated that anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 elite German troops were being moved south to defend this redoubt. They warned Eisenhower that the Nazis were preparing for a fanatical last stand that would make the bloody Italian campaign look like a skirmish. Eisenhower studied these reports with grave seriousness. He was a man of caution, a logistical genius who felt the weight of every casualty. He had fought the Germans for 3 years. He knew their capacity for recovery. He knew their tenacity. The fighting in Italy had demonstrated just how effectively German forces could defend mountainous terrain, turning every ridge into a killing zone. The Battle of the Bulge, just months prior, had proven that the Germans could still launch devastating surprise attacks even when they appeared defeated. The prospect of fighting in the Alps for another year or two was Eisenhower's recurring nightmare. He imagined the war dragging on into 1946. Every month the conflict continued meant thousands more American casualties. It meant more families receiving those dreaded telegrams. It meant political pressure from a war-weary American public that wanted their sons and husbands home. In Eisenhower's cold calculus, Berlin was merely a geographical location, a symbol. The Alpine redoubt was a strategic threat. If the Nazis were allowed to consolidate in the mountains, the war might never truly end. It would fester like a wound. Therefore, eliminating the redoubt mattered more than capturing the German capital. So, he made his decision. It was a choice that prioritized military caution over political ambition. American armies would not race for Berlin. They would turn south. They would hunt down this phantom fortress. They would crush the Nazi resistance in the Alps and ensure the war ended quickly and decisively. It was a reasonable decision based on the information Eisenhower had. There was just one devastating problem. The National Redoubt didn't exist. It was a lie. A propaganda fabrication created by Joseph Goebbels to terrify the Allies, combined with the paranoid delusions of Allied intelligence officers who saw monsters in the shadows. There were no underground factories. There were no stockpiles of food. There were no elite armies gathering in the snow. On April 12th, Eisenhower issued his detailed orders, sealing the fate of the capital. Bradley's 12th Army Group would halt at the Elbe, Simpson's 9th Army was paralyzed, and Patton's 3rd Army would turn south toward Austria and Bavaria. The mission was clear. Locate and destroy the National Redoubt. Capture Munich, the birthplace of Nazism. Seize Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat. Prevent the Nazi hierarchy from establishing their mountain fortress. Patton read the orders with barely controlled fury. He felt the strategic blunder in his bones. He was being sent on a wild goose chase, hunting for ghosts in the mountains, while the real prize, the beating heart of the enemy, was sitting defenseless 50 miles from Simpson's position. Every military instinct he possessed screamed that this was wrong. "We're going to regret this," Patton told General Omar Bradley, his voice dropping to a gravelly warning. "Berlin matters. The capital is what counts. History remembers who takes the capital. Let me take my army to Berlin and end this war properly." Bradley sympathized. He too was a soldier who understood the value of objective-based warfare. But he was a subordinate to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was the supreme commander. Patton had no choice. With a heavy heart, he turned his 3rd Army south. His armored divisions, which had been racing east toward Czechoslovakia and potentially Berlin, now pivoted toward Munich and the Austrian border. The most aggressive, unstoppable army in Europe was being redirected away from the enemy's throat. To be fair to Eisenhower, he wasn't just acting on bad intelligence. He was also navigating a minefield of international politics. He was bound by agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. There, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had sliced up the map of Germany like a cake. They had agreed on occupation zones. Berlin, geographically, sat deep inside the zone assigned to the Soviet Union. It was over 100 miles east of the agreed-upon boundary for American and British forces. Allied planners had drawn lines on maps that were supposed to govern the post-war world. Some of Eisenhower's staff argued vehemently that this made racing for Berlin pointless. Why lose 10,000 or 20,000 American lives capturing a city that they would be legally obligated to hand over to the Soviets weeks later? Why pay for real estate with blood only to evict yourself? Furthermore, why antagonize Stalin? The alliance was fragile. Violating the occupation agreements by seizing the Soviet prize might trigger a new conflict before the old one was even finished. But Patton, Simpson, and other field commanders saw it differently. To them, possession was 9/10 of the law. Capturing Berlin would give the United States massive negotiating leverage. It would demonstrate the supremacy of American military capability. It would allow American forces to witness firsthand what was happening in Eastern Europe before the Iron Curtain slammed shut. It would save the civilians of Berlin from the wrath of the Red Army. The debate, however, was academic. Eisenhower had made his decision. The die was cast. American armies would hunt the ghost fortress in the Alps, while the Soviets were given a free hand to take Berlin. For the soldiers of Simpson's 9th Army, the halt order was incomprehensible. It defied every instinct of the warrior. They sat on the western banks of the Elbe River, cleaning their weapons, writing letters home, and staring at the highway that led to Berlin. It was a paved road to victory, and they were forbidden to step on it. The scene at the river became a tragic theater of war. German refugees streamed past American positions, fleeing east to west in a panic that bordered on madness. They were running from the Red Army, desperate to reach the safety of American lines before the Soviets caught them. They clogged the bridges, they swam the river, they floated on makeshift rafts. Their stories were the stuff of nightmares. American soldiers heard breathless reports of systematic crimes against women, widespread looting, and summary executions. The refugees described the Soviet soldiers not as liberators, but as avenging angels, fueled by 4 years of hatred and a desire for retribution for German atrocities in Russia. They said the Red Army was taking revenge, and civilians were paying the price in blood and fire. One American lieutenant, watching the chaotic procession, wrote home to his wife with a sense of helpless confusion. "We're 50 miles from Berlin. We could be there in 2 days. Instead, we're sitting on this river watching German civilians run from the Russians like they're running from the devil himself. The men are asking why we're not advancing. They want to finish it. I don't have an answer for them." It was a surreal, haunting contrast. On the West Bank, American soldiers sat in relative quiet. They brewed coffee, repaired their jeeps, and played cards. The sun shone on their helmets. But on the East Bank, just across the water, they could hear the distant, agonizing screams of refugees and the ominous rhythmic rumble of Soviet artillery getting closer. The sounds of desperation carried across the water, a plea for help that went unanswered. The frustration was universal. These were soldiers who had fought their way across the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, through the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge, across the Rhine, and deep into the heart of the Reich. They couldn't understand why they were being stopped when victory total, absolute victory, was within eyesight. They had the momentum, they had the supplies. They had broken the back of the German army. Why stop now? Some units, unable to bear the inactivity, sent unauthorized reconnaissance patrols across the Elbe toward Berlin. They were testing the waters, hoping the orders might change, hoping that perhaps Eisenhower would change his mind. Simpson allowed limited patrols, but was strict. No major advance would happen without permission from Shea. That permission never came. Instead, as the days of April ticked by, American forces watched the eastern horizon light up at night. It was a display of terrifying power. Soviet artillery, thousands of guns, including the screaming Stalin organs, was pounding German positions around Berlin. The sky flickered with the flashes of heavy ordnance. The ground trembled even 50 miles away. The final battle for the German capital was beginning. It was the crescendo of the European war, a clash of titans that would result in hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the United States Army, the most powerful mechanized force the world had ever seen, was sitting on the sidelines. They were spectators to the apocalypse. The soldiers could hear the guns. They could see the plumes of smoke rising in the distance, blotting out the sun. They knew that history was being made just beyond the horizon, written in fire and blood, and they had been ordered not to participate. Private James Anderson of the 83rd Infantry Division captured the mood in his diary, scrawling words that echoed the sentiment of an entire army. "Today we heard that the Russians have started their final attack on Berlin. The noise is constant, like thunder that never stops. We're close enough to hear the individual shells landing." Every man in the company is asking the same question. Why aren't we moving? Why did we come all this way just to watch? The answer lay hundreds of miles to the south, in the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, where Patton's Third Army was frantically searching for a fortress that was never there. They found no underground factories. They found no stockpiles of superweapons. They found only a few scattered units and the breathtaking beauty of the mountains. The National Redoubt was a myth, but the price of believing that myth was Berlin. While American tanks idled on the Elbe, the Soviet flag was hoisted over the Reichstag, and the Iron Curtain began its slow, grinding descent across Europe. The war ended, but the peace that followed was shaped by the silence of the Ninth Army on the banks of the river, waiting for an order that never came.